Hello and welcome to our apologetics series, where we talk about reason and evidence for faith. And the question we're going to be looking at in this first video is concerning history, and especially the history of the Bible. Why trust the Bible? This is a question I often get asked. People who say, you base all your faith, you base everything you say on the Bible, but how do you know you can trust it? How do you know it hasn't been changed over time? Maybe the Bible was originally a faithful record of what happened, but then Christians changed it to say what they wanted it to say. How do you know you can trust the people who wrote it? Maybe the first authors were making up a story to suit their purposes, a story to make them look good. Maybe the authors didn't know what they were talking about. Maybe they were writing about things they'd never actually seen. And is there any external evidence to support the Bible, or are we just supposed to believe it on the basis of its own claims? These are the sort of questions I often get asked. Now, I think it's a little bit like this. When I went up to secondary school, I got told that a while back some boys had hosed down the staff common room with a fire extinguisher. I had to decide if I believed that story. Now, what do you do when you want to work out if you believe a story like that? You might ask how many people are telling you the story. If one person tells you it, not very likely. If everyone in your year tells you it, a bit more likely that it's true. You might ask how long ago it was. If it's supposed to have happened yesterday, the event should be fresh in everyone's memory. If it's supposed to have happened 30 years ago, well, 5 or 6 generations of boys will have come and gone in the school in that time, and it's probable that the details could have been altered or forgotten or distorted. The longer the separation in time is between when the events happened and when you get the story, the more skeptical you're likely to be. You might ask, are they telling the same story? If you hear a different story one day to the one you heard the day before, that suggests it's being changed. If you hear different stories from different people, that would be a problem as well. But if everybody hears the same story and it stays the same for years, that suggests it's very reliable. That suggests it's true. Well, you might ask, who's telling me the story? Are they people I trust? Are they people I've found to be trustworthy on other stories they've told me? Are they people who have something to gain by lying? Or do they have nothing to gain, no reason to lie? Do I trust them? And then you might look for any external evidence. You might go to the staff room, and if you find it being cleaned, that suggests that the story is true. Is there external evidence? These are the questions, effectively, that we're asking of the Bible when we try and work out, do we trust it? Is it reliable? So let's start with, has the Bible been changed? Has it come down to us reliably? Or could it have been altered in transmission? Now, when historians think about a question like this, they take a work and they ask 3 questions of it. They ask, how many copies do we have of a work? How much time has passed between the oldest copy and the time of writing? And how much do those copies we have disagree? So first of all, the time that's passed. How much time has passed between the first time of writing and the copy you've got? If the work has been circulating for 900 years before the oldest copy you have was written, that's a lot of time in which it could have been altered. If it's not been circulating for so long, it's more reliable. If you only have a couple of copies of the work, it's less reliable. More copies, more reliable. And then you look across all those copies and you note down any point where any 2 disagree. And you add all those points up and you say, across all these copies, what percentage of the work is disputed? If it's a lot, you might not trust the work. If it's a little, you're more likely to trust it. You can see here, I've got Caesar's Gallic Wars as an example of a text from the ancient world around the same time as the Christian New Testament that every historian I know regards as reliable. Now, our oldest manuscript of it was written 900 years after the first copy. We have 11 copies of it, and I believe it's something like 0.5% is disputed across them. This is considered a pretty reliable document from the ancient world, because although there's a 900-year gap, we've got 11 copies, and they're pretty unanimous. It's the same story with the Peloponnesian Wars of Thucydides. This is one of our best histories for Greece, pre-Christian Greece. And you can see there that our oldest copy is 1100 years later than the first time of writing. It was being copied out for 1100 years before any of the manuscripts, the copies we have, were written. We only have 9 copies, but they're even more in agreement. So again, the Peloponnesian War is regarded as pretty reliable. The best text from the ancient world is Homer's Iliad, which was a religious text, effectively. And there's only 400 years between the first copy and our oldest copy. Only 400 years of it being written out before we come to the copies we have. So it's a lot more reliable. There's 643 copies of the Iliad, and only about 0.1% of them is disputed. Very, very reliable. Best text from the ancient world until you come to the Christian New Testament. Our oldest manuscripts of the New Testament, papyri fragments preserved in the hot sands of Egypt, come from about 40 to 60 years after the time of writing. There are 27,000 extant manuscripts of the Christian New Testament in one form or another. And across the 9,000 or so in Greek, which is the largest group in one language, there's only a 0.01% disputed reading. In other words, the New Testament, in terms of its textual evidence, is thousands of times more reliable than the best texts of the ancient world that everyone accepts. If you're going to dismiss the New Testament as unreliable, if you're going to say we can't trust that we have an original copy of the New Testament, then you can't trust that we have an original copy of anything that has come down to us until the age of printing. You have to say that we can't know anything about anything more than about 500, 600 years old. The evidence that the Bible has been preserved accurately, has not been changed, is incredibly strong. Thousands of manuscripts spread across hundreds of years, and the oldest of them only 40 to 60 years after the time of writing. And they don't disagree on anything of significance. Most of that 0.01% is using a few synonyms, a few words that mean the same but are slightly different, and 2 passages that appear in some manuscripts but not others, Mark 16 and John 8. No point of significance to Christianity is disputed across any of those manuscripts. So has the Bible been changed? The evidence says a resounding no. But do we trust the authors? If we're saying it hasn't been changed, that the text we've got has been handed down to us accurately from the first days of Christianity, that's useless unless we trust the people who wrote it. So do we trust them? Do they have anything to gain by lying? Well, here are the main authors of the Christian New Testament. And let's have a look at what happened to them, at what they gained by circulating these stories that they wrote. Paul was the largest single author of the New Testament. He was executed for it by decapitation. Mark wrote one of the first Gospels. He was beaten to death for it. Matthew was stabbed to death for a change of pace. John was exiled for life to a small island, the island of Patmos here in the Mediterranean. Peter, the leader of the apostles and the man behind several of the Gospels, one of the leaders of the early church, he was crucified upside down. Not a good way to go. And James was executed with the sword. So almost all the authors of the New Testament died for what they said. Of course, people will die for all sorts of bad reasons, but I don't know of anybody who will die for something they know to be a lie. These were the men who wrote the New Testament, and they were willing to die for what they claimed. That tells us, if nothing else, they were sincere. They weren't making it up. You don't make up something that only condemns you to a painful death. And another way to approach the same question, what did they get out of it? Did they have a reason to lie? Well, if you were going to make up a religion, if you're going to make up something like the Bible, you'd think you'd at least make sure you got something out of it. You'd think it would at least make you look good. But this is how the Bible describes Jesus' early followers, the people who wrote the Bible. Jesus says to them, "Are you so dull?" several times. In other words, how thick are you? Mark's gospel records him as a young man following Jesus, running away when people came to seize Jesus, losing his clothes and fleeing naked in the night. Pretty shameful, especially in that culture. All the Gospels agree that his followers fled Jesus in his hour of need and deserted him. They all agree that Peter disowned Jesus, claimed he'd never met him when put to the test. Acts records that Paul persecuted the church and originally didn't believe Christianity and hated it. This is not the sort of thing you'd make up if you were making up the Christian story. You wouldn't make up a story where you and all the other leaders of the early church appeared as cowardly fools or as skeptics who hated the Christian message. You'd make up a better story, one that had more convincing leaders and one that didn't make you look like a cowardly idiot. But even more than that, the Bible doesn't even address the debates of the church in the first century when these documents were being written. Again, if you were going to make up the founding documents of a religion, you think you'd at least make up something that supported your side of whatever arguments were going on. But the Bible doesn't speak into the things the early church was arguing about. It doesn't speak into debates about apostasy or circumcision. The Bible doesn't do much to establish the authority of Christian leaders. If you were going to make this up, you think you'd make up something that established your authority and told people to obey you. And the Bible's contents weren't popular. If you were going to make something up, make up a religion, you think you'd make up something that would go down well with the culture you existed in, the culture you were operating in. But the Bible goes right up against the most precious tenets of Jewish culture. It says the Jews are no longer the only people who are the people of God. It says they can't expect a Messiah who's a conquering king. It says the temple and the land are not of first importance anymore. And it says that the transcendent God took on human form. Deeply unpopular. To the Greek culture that surrounded Judaism, the Hellenic world firmly believed that the physical world was bad and the spiritual world was good. But the Bible says that God, who was spirit, took on physical form. The Greek philosophers found this bizarre. If you were going to make up a religion, you'd make up something that was a little bit less controversial, a little bit more credible. And the Roman power that dominated the world at the time believed strongly in dignity, hierarchy, and authority. And to them, the Bible's story of a God and king who was crucified was nonsensical, silly, ridiculous. The Bible message is not calculated to be popular in the first century. It doesn't establish the authority of Christian leaders or of any of the people who wrote it. It doesn't gain anything for any side in the debates at the time. And the people who wrote it were willing to record themselves as foolish idiots, and they were willing to die by torture for what they believed. That says to me that if nothing else, they weren't making this up. Well, the next question we said was, were they in a position to know? It's no good having an accurate copy of what they originally wrote passed down to you. It's no good them being entirely sincere if they weren't in a position to know what they were talking about. So here's the opening to Luke's Gospel, one of the accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, he says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Do you see what Luke is saying here, right at the beginning of his gospel? He's saying, we've had eyewitness evidence, and we've heard it from the mouths of the original eyewitnesses. And so I decided to investigate it all, to talk to those eyewitnesses, and to write it all down into a systematic study so that you could see the evidence for the Christian story that's been passed on to you. In other words, Luke, one of the writers of the gospel, is saying very clearly, this is reliable. This is a careful investigation based on direct testimony from the eyewitnesses. This is compiled from those who were there, who saw, who were in a position to know what happened, in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Maybe we're skeptical about that. Is there any evidence, we say, to support this claim that the documents in the New Testament are eyewitness accounts of Jesus's life? Well, yes, there is. The Gospels often record Jesus traveling from one place to another. Archaeology has studied the distances between those places, and the travel times the Gospel gives are exactly what you'd expect for a group of fairly fit men on foot traveling between those places. In other words, the travel times recorded for Jesus exactly fit with what they would be, which suggests that the record was written down by somebody who was actually there, who remembered how long it took them to walk between these places. John's Gospel, in one place, records Jesus walking in Solomon's colonnade in the temple, and he records the time of year at which it happened as well. Now, archaeology has dug up the temple, has found Solomon's colonnade, and it would have been sheltered at that time of year from the prevailing winds, just the place you'd go for a bit of a walk. Another point in John's Gospel records the disciples catching 153 fish on one occasion. There's no reason to record that number. It has no significance. It doesn't add anything to what the Gospel is saying about Jesus. The only reason for that number to be there is that John was there and remembered them counting out 153 fish. It's the kind of detail you get in an eyewitness account, but not in something that's being made up or an account that's being constructed by somebody who wasn't there. One final detail: several of the Gospels record Jesus being on a boat in the Lake of Galilee and sleeping in the back of the boat, which is a bit odd. Normally you'd want to sleep in the middle of the boat. But again, archaeology looking at those boats has found that at the back they normally kept a steersman's cushion. If you wanted a nap, that was a place you could put your head down and have a pillow for it. All the little details of the Gospel fit. Everywhere we've tested them, they ring true. In other words, all the evidence suggests these genuinely were eyewitness accounts. So we've said that the Gospel has been passed down to us reliably. The Bible, the New Testament, has been preserved down the years. All the evidence points to that. We've said that the people who wrote it had nothing to gain and that all the evidence supports their claim to have been eyewitnesses. But is there any external evidence to the Bible for the things it talks about? Well, here are a few pieces I think are pretty cool. The Gospels record Jesus repeatedly visiting Capernaum and preaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Here is a picture of the Capernaum synagogue because people had dug it up. It was there. Something even more incredible, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, passes on greetings to the Christians at Rome from the Christians at Corinth, and in particular from a chap called Erastus, who he says was the city's director of public works. Recently, some excavations at Corinth found this plaque outside a bathhouse they had been excavating, a bathhouse from the 1st century AD. The plaque is heavily abbreviated and in Latin, but it says Erastus. You can just see Erastus there. The city's director of public works arranged for this to be built. So here is a piece of archaeological evidence confirming that this person who is mentioned in a throwaway comment in one of Paul's letters was around and was exactly who that letter said he was. Here's something even cooler: the Nazareth Tablet, dated to around AD 40. This was found in Nazareth, saying, "By order of the Roman Emperor, be it known that grave robbers will be punished by death." Now, this was weird for a couple of reasons. Firstly, grave robbing was usually a very minor crime, small fine, not the death penalty. Secondly, the Roman emperor very seldom bothered himself with the provinces, and if he did, he just sent a missive usually to the capital, not to Nazareth, which was a little town in the middle of nowhere. To have something from the Roman emperor at Nazareth talking about grave robbing is like looking in the news and finding that the President of the United States had flown straight to Romford to talk about littering. You'd ask yourself, what's happened in Romford to make the President of America turn up there? Why is he talking about littering? What's happened with littering to make it suddenly a big deal? Well, what could have happened to do with Nazareth to make empty tombs a big deal? But the Christian claim that a man from Nazareth had risen from the dead, and that his tomb stood empty as proof. It's the only good reason to explain why this tablet was erected there in Nazareth, that somebody in Rome had been hearing about an empty tomb to do with someone from Nazareth, and had decided that there must be something to do with grave robbing going on, and so had ordered this inscription put up. In other words, here is evidence, archaeological evidence, for the very core of the Christian message, the claim that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead and his tomb stood empty as proof. So here are the questions we started with. Do you believe the story? How many people are telling you? Well, we've got four Gospels and then 23 letters supporting the Christian story. And they all agree about the core of the Christian faith. What's more, we've got 27,000 manuscripts of those documents spread across half a dozen languages, and they all agree. There's a vast number of voices saying the same thing. How long ago was it? Well, the oldest of the documents were written within a generation of the events they recorded. In other words, most of the people who saw what happened would have still been alive within one generation. That suggests, compared to other historical documents, what we have is very reliable. Are they telling the same story? Yes, that story didn't change down the years. The New Testament fragments we have from the 1st century say the same thing as those from the 4th century, and all the fragments agree. Do you trust them? Well, if you don't trust the authors of the Bible, you have to conclude that a whole lot of intelligent and educated people, which they must have been because they wrote these books, a whole lot of intelligent and educated people sat down and agreed to write to tell basically the same story, and all to tell a story that would get them beaten up, driven out of their communities, and eventually killed, a story that would make them look like idiots and cowards, and a story which they wouldn't gain them anything, wouldn't even contribute to the debates of their day. How likely is that? Is it not much more likely that these people wrote this story and stuck to it, even when it cost them, because they were convinced it was true? And is there any evidence to back it up? Loads. From the details of the sheltered colonnade to walk in, or the steersman's cushion in the boat, to the archaeological evidence of Erastus's inscription or the Nazareth Tablet, there's a bunch of external evidence to support this claim. Suppose you are at school and you're told that some boys have hosed down the staff common room with a fire extinguisher. Suppose 5 or 6 people tell you that, and they keep telling you that, and their story doesn't change as the weeks go by. Suppose it's supposed to have been something that only happened a few weeks ago. Suppose they've got nothing to gain by telling you that story, and suppose that when you then go to the common room, you find it's being cleaned by a professional cleaning company, and that there's water and foam stains around it. What would you conclude? Would you not conclude that this story was true? But if you conclude that the story of the Bible is true, if you conclude even this much, that the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life, are true, here's what you have to accept. Here's what it means for them to be true. They all agree very clearly that there was a man named Jesus from Nazareth, that he said incredible things. He claimed to be God. He claimed to be eternal and to forgive sins. That he healed people no one else could heal and did it with a word. That he taught incredible, new, striking things. That he died on a Roman cross publicly in front of the whole city of Jerusalem. All the Gospels agree that he rose from the dead. They're filled with accounts of eyewitnesses who went there, found his tomb empty, found the only thing left in it was the grave clothes, the most valuable thing in that tomb. If you're going to rob a tomb, you'd leave the body, which was worthless. You'd take the valuable cloth. But they all agree that the clothes were left. They all agree that they saw Jesus alive, not just once, but over 40 days after his rising from the dead. That they talked with him, sat down with him, had meals with him, ate a breakfast that he cooked beside the Sea of Galilee, and saw him eat and drink. Hallucinations don't do that. Hallucinations don't cook you breakfast. This was no hallucination. This was fact. They all agree on that. And they all agree that he calls us to follow him. and promises to save us if we will trust him and follow him. I'm convinced that the Bible is reliable. I'm convinced that what has come down to us is the accounts of those first eyewitnesses. I'm convinced that they were trustworthy. I am convinced that they believed what they said. And all the evidence verifies their claims. That means I'm convinced that Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be God, that he proved it by dying and rising from the dead. And that means that he's somebody to listen to and somebody to follow. I hope that you will feel the same. God bless.